And good morning. It's time for the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by Renegade River in Spring Lake. And now your host, Mike Hewitt.
Hey, good morning, Brian. Good morning, Jim Riley. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Jim, help me with my memory here. What was it Brian Williams did that caused him so much trouble?
You mean Brian Williams, the former NBC News anchor? Actually, he was the highest paid anchor at the time of any of the major networks, and Brian Williams also was the anchor of the most popular of all of the television news shows. Brian Williams kind of expanded on his experiences. He would take various trips, in many cases, into areas where there was military action going on, and he made commentary about his closeness, his nearness to being in danger. He also made up a really goofy one. He said that, by the way, he did many of these, which is why he is no longer the anchor. But to me, the goofiest one was he said that he had been given some kind of a trophy. I forget exactly what it was, but by the members of SEAL Team 6 who had taken out Osama bin Laden, and he was very proud of that. That was totally made up, among many other things. So he was a what we call a fabulist, someone who made up stuff.
What I find fascinating...
Lion Brian, by the way, is another name for him.
Lion Brian?
Lion Brian.
Listen, part of an enigma. We've been talking about enigma lately on this show, and one of the enigmas I find that I just can't get my head around, really, truly I can't, folks, is we take a fellow like Brian Williams, who must have been telling the truth the majority of the time. He just embellished and exaggerated some things about himself. And we take him and we cast him back down to the bottom. He loses his bit. And listen, I think that's okay, by the way. I don't think he should be in that capacity, exaggerating and telling falsehoods. So I agree with what's come to pass, but what I find as an enigma is we take a person like Hillary Clinton, who has lies that I put at least at that level.
Many more documented lies,
I mean,
certainly.
Just over the things that where you go, no kidding. Like when she left, of course, this isn't probably a lie. Maybe this is just a matter of a personal opinion, but she stated that they were dead broke when they left the White House. Forget the $12 million.
That's a lie. That's not a personal opinion. That's a lie.
Well, maybe you think having $12 million is broke. It's a relative statement. But when you sit and you read that, you go, okay, well, let's be generous, it was a misstatement. She claims to have been instrumental in the Northern Ireland peace process. The problem with that is that none of the people involved remember her being there. She wasn't there at all. And nobody seems to mind. She said, I'll tell you what I found one of the more outrageously disrespectful lies of the lies, and that's without getting to Benghazi. But one of the lies she told was right after 9/11, she said that Chelsea Clinton had been jogging around the World Trade Center that morning. And I thought that was just such an outrageous lie that she later had to retreat from and admit that Chelsea was anywhere near that area.
Let me add another one that is absolutely meaningless, much like the Chelsea one, where she said that she was named for Sir Edmund Hillary.
Got that on my list.
The first man who had conquered, along with his Sherpa guide.
But he did that 6 years after she was born.
Well, Mount Everest, and he didn't climb that mountain until 6 years after she was born. So, yes, she has a long, long history, and as you said, just excusing the Benghazi events and others, I do kind of remember that her husband was involved in something with an unpaid intern the same age as her daughter. I think there were some lies involved in that, too.
There were, but I got to tell you what, and he was president, so he's yesterday's news. When I look at her, I feel like she's the day before yesterday's news herself. But what I get, where I'm going with the enigma, this lady says that she was under sniper fire when they landed in Bosnia.
That's exactly almost identical to what Lion Brian Williams
and
had
that's
said.
The correlation. I'm thinking, wait a minute, as a society, that's the enigma, exactly right. As a society, we say we do not want to receive our news from somebody who has a problem with the truth, but we're okay with making someone the commander-in-chief and leader of the proverbial free world that has at least as bad of a problem with the truth.
At the least, yes.
And listen, I think that's a monster-sized enigma as we approach a presidential election cycle, that it feels like, loving to use that word because the progressives love it, it feels like they just plainly ignore that. And I don't know how you can ignore that. It's not a difference in ideological opinion. It's a bold-faced lie.
I would suggest there are two possible answers to your enigma, and I'd like you, I share your confusion that this only, that being believable, it seems only to be an interesting character trait by some folks. But in Hillary's case, I will come up with these two. Number one, the people who sent Lion Brian running were involved in a news show, and people who watch the evening news are a tiny, tiny percentage of the voting population in the country. It's the small group of people who tend to be a little older, who are interested in hearing at least some semblance of the truth, as opposed to something totally made up. As opposed to the voters, which is what, 50, 60% of the registered voters in the country, which is in the multiple tens of millions in any election. So in one hand, you've got folks that turn on the news, they want truth, but that's a tiny amount. I believe ABC, NBC News is something in the neighborhood of 10 million people a night. The other possible explanation for this enigma is that most people do not know what you just reported on the radio. They do not know of all of the confirmed lies of Hillary Clinton.
I don't know how they can't.
Well, because they're not interested. We know that any number of folks have done these very painful, as far as I'm concerned, videos interviewing college graduates and others. They're saying, what are we celebrating on the 4th of July weekend? They not only don't know that it's independence, they don't know from what country we were declaring independence from. In many cases, as a matter of fact, it would be frightening if you could get 100 college graduates and ask them within 50 years, when was World War II or when was the Civil War? So, in other words, we got a bunch of dummies out there, Guy. That explains a lot.
To me, though, not knowing something from history, I go, okay, listen, it's very important to me, but I get that it may not be important to some people.
Well, where would they get it?
But
that's the problem.
This isn't really history. This is current events.
Yep.
Worse than that, this is projecting what we want our future to be like. And so it's not me debating whether Thomas Jefferson was a good or not a good president. It's what we're going to do with the next generation. And it just is I can't even find the words to describe how outrageous I think it is to say Brian Williams has got to go because he's a liar. Let's make Hillary Clinton a president, even though she is a liar.
Well, perhaps it's an indication that the media has, the rest of the media has not made it an important piece of information to pass on when they're on television. We know that the vast, vast majority, probably upwards of 70% of those who provide television media are liberal, are contributors. We know that George Stephanopoulos and many of the others are not just contributors and open liberals, but they've actually been involved in Democrat campaigns. And they're not reporting this information, so that even if you are interested in hearing the truth, I'd be very surprised. Certainly this morning on the morning news, talking about Hillary's first interview in many, many months, they made almost no mention of the content of what she was saying. They focused on how well she looked and how well she presented herself. So I think the problem is, in many cases, folks who do care and who are interested in finding out about the candidates aren't hearing the things that you have pointed out today.
I don't know how they cannot. I don't know how they cannot hear about the Benghazi situation. I know everyone's tired of hearing about it, but they're not actually hearing it.
It hasn't been resolved. We still don't know what happened.
We're getting a greater idea because of the emails that were recently released.
None of that is on the major news. That's the problem.
But we become aware by being aware of those that we have a problem.
Yes.
So she's in communication that evening with the president, and she's telling him, I got this under control, it's okay. And we, it obviously wasn't under control. On the list of lies was that we know for a fact when she used that video on YouTube as the excuse for what took place in Libya, we know now because of her emails that was concocted. And listen, this is a slippery slope we're on. This is a big decision we're going to make. And it doesn't matter whether we agree with her ideologically or not. I don't know how the folks that say, yes, I like what she's articulating in terms of a campaign, can ignore these things. I can't imagine not educating myself before I go into the voting booth. I just find that a travesty for our future.
Well, it is frightening, and there's a term for those folks. They're called low information voters, LOVOs. And time and again, you can talk with folks who either are single issue voters. There are people who only care about, let's take an issue like, let's say, gay marriage or abortion or gun rights. There are folks that have only one reason to vote. Others, maybe they're members of a church, maybe they're a member of a union. The leaders within those organizations will say, look, you've got to vote in this particular way. And that's good enough for those who vote. But our education system has not engendered the concept of asking tough questions.
Do you think it's the educational system, or do you think there's more of a problem at play than that? And the reason I'm asking is that I'm 54, but when I grew up and had dinner at home with the family, there was a lot of current event conversations, and I don't know that that's happening anymore. In fact, they're building houses nowadays without dining rooms.
Oh, I did not know that.
And so, you know what I mean? That because our culture is changing. But listen, when I was growing up and I got to hear my father and my mother discussing what their view was of, at the time, it was segregation. There was a whole bunch of issues, gun control, the '68 Gun Control Act that came about. There were a lot of things, and I listened to my mother and my father talk, and I drew from that conversation what my parents' direction was, and frankly, my foundation sits on those conversations. But I wonder now when those conversations, I'm not saying in every family, folks, I'm not painting with that broad of a brush, but I think those kind of family conversations are not happening in the kind of percentages that they used to in America. And so if we're wondering where our young are getting their political views and we're not sharing ours with them, we have to know it's coming from the media.
Well,
in sound bites and Facebook and Twitter, to your point earlier before we were on the air. There's
been a recent study, a report of some sort. It seems to be plausible. I don't know if it's rigorous enough to be true, but it sounded plausible that the millennium generation gets the vast amount of their news from Facebook and Twitter. But I would just add one thing. You asked if it's home or if it's their education. We do know that the collapse of the American family is accelerating, and the concept of sitting home with mom and dad and having a conversation about issues, political issues, and social issues and that sort, that's been reduced. And that used to be something that parents would use to offset the other information that young people get. And in today's world, it might be the social media. But we know, and teachers will tell you proudly, that the vast majority of teachers in our public schools in this country, and an even greater majority of those educators within our colleges and community colleges and universities are very, very liberal. They're not just Democrats. They are liberal Democrats. So when you take a young person and you put them in a public school system for 13 or 14 or even 15 years in many cases, and then if you add on another 4, 5, 6, however many years college may be, they may not be in a madrasa where they're being told certain things, but the concept that, for instance, capitalism is bad, the Republicans are greedy, the entire concept that the Democrat Party is different from the Republican Party in certain ways, or that big government is good for you or bad for you, those kinds of things, the environmental concepts are all slid in, as we now know. As a matter of fact, we know that environmentalism and many other things are slid into things like math and science. So, yes, if you're home with your children, you can have conversations with them at night and perhaps give another side. But we know that the information that they're getting that has any taint whatsoever about economics or politics comes from a very, very extremely left side.
I think you're exactly right. Listen, folks, we're gonna go to break, but when we come back, I think we're going to have on the line with us Reverend Thorpe. Is that right?
He said his name was Eli or something like that.
Yeah, that's Reverend Thorpe.
Good.
Yep. And him and I and Jim, we're going to be discussing a conundrum, to use that word, on gay marriage and the black church. And I'm looking forward to finding out what his views are. Folks, we'll be right back.
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station.
Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show. You're listening to Mike Hewitt. I'm in with Jim Riley, and with us on the line is Reverend Thorpe. Reverend Thorpe, welcome to my show. Are you with me?
Welcome back to the show.
Yes, I am still here.
Welcome back to the show.
Good. Reverend Thorpe, are you with us?
Yes, I am. It's
Very,
great to
very
be
nice.
on your show. Thank you for having me.
Yep. Listen, I appreciate you. The topic for us, folks, and I'm really excited about getting Reverend Thorpe's take on it, but is gay marriage and the black church conundrum. What am I talking about, Reverend Thorpe? What's the conundrum for the black community churches?
Well, I really wanted to, and thank you again for having me on the show, was really to be able to sort of highlight sort of the divide in the black church as well as other churches and some of the narrative that has been sort of expressed in the media as it relates to the whole, the Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage. And obviously, the black church has a rich tradition, historically significant in the black community, as the epicenter of social change, the epicenter of economics in our community, the epicenter of spirituality in our community. And so as I've been sort of evaluating and listening to some of the narrative on this specific ruling in gay rights, I thought it was important to really talk about the conundrum, the difficulty that the black church may be having in some parts of the country and as in the church, not only with the leadership of the church, but also even with the congregation of the church. You're dealing with sort of the scriptural interpretation and the traditional history of Scripture as we understand it, and then you're also dealing with sort of the evolution of society. And how do those merge? Is there still a divide? Does Scripture reference deal with gay marriage and gay rights? And so there's scriptural interpretations that we understand, and there's a biblical understanding in terms of how people view marriage from the church perspective. And then you also have then sort of the democracy, the rights of individuals. And so you're dealing with a conundrum there in terms of, the democracy and the theocracy. You're dealing with democracy, which, is the rights of individuals that are governed by people who have been put in positions to make sure that all people have rights and able to express their freedoms. And then you have theocracy, which is governed by God and specifically the scriptural truths that point us in a direction in terms of how we are to live our life. And so that's a conundrum there. I mean, how do you reconcile those two? And I believe that you can reconcile those two because of the essence of who God is in Scripture.
I got to tell you, when I look out to different churches, regardless of their ethnic foundation, let me use as an example in the Grand Haven community. Over the weekend, I'm standing downtown Grand Haven, and in one direction, I'm looking at a large, probably century-old church building, and out in front of it, there's a huge banner that says, "We accept and welcome gay marriage," and there are the rainbow flags posted in the front and on the side yard. I look in the opposite direction to the other end of Grand Haven's Main Street, and what used to be a cross on a hill is now an anchor. And And so it is an evolution of democracy. There's no question about that. How is your church, or how are you, Reverend Thorpe, going to try to bring these two circumstances together, both democracy and theology?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's important. I've been nurtured in the bosom of the church. I found my calling in the church. The church has been a great tool for me to really discover my purpose and destiny. So I think that there's a couple of things to deal with here. First of all, you have to understand black theology versus the black church. And there's a difference there. The black theology emphasizes the role of Christian faith in addressing, racism and other forms of oppression that has historically been significant in the African American community. And black theology has used the gospel message of Jesus to really highlight the importance of the right of freedom. And so as we've been dealing with oppression in our community and historical oppression in our society, black theology has always used the Bible or Scripture to make a point that we have the same freedoms as everyone else based upon the gospel message of Jesus. And then you have the black church that, while it's focused on social concerns, has historically really emphasized the faithfulness to something which is bound by pledge or duty. I mean, it has always implied sort of a strict and continuing faithfulness to an obligation, trust, or duty based upon historical scriptural interpretation and understanding sort of a belief or a point of view that is accepted within unthinking conventional reverence. And so it's sort of what I would consider the black church is performing the acts of religious practice and rituals, but yet there's a disconnect to the essence of Scripture. So when we start talking about black theology and the black church, there's a separation and divide there. Black theology deals with the social change and leveraging Scripture to highlight social change so that African Americans can have the same freedoms that have historically not been available to us, or this type of oppression. And then there's the black church, which is dealing with sort of the duty, the acts of religion that have been traditionally passed down to us, such as Sunday school, Bible study. And there's a divide there, but we need to be able to bring that divide and understand that there is a connection between not only black theology and the black church, because when we start talking about gay marriage and gay rights, we have to understand that not only are we ministering to the sinner, but we're also understanding that the purpose of the church is to be able to reconcile and to restore people back into the image and likeness of God. And so there's a number of things that are occurring there. I mean, I consider this sort of diversity of thought versus religious rigidity. And we're dealing now with a millennial generation that considers themselves spiritual but not religious. And because of the millennial generation, you see now the evolution of the diversity in our society. There are many more options to people becoming spiritual. There's not as much of a need in terms of this millennial generation believing that they need to find and discover their purpose through a church setting. And so as the church is wrestling with that, the message of the church has to be based upon the essence of Scripture, not about condemnation. Because remember, Scripture talks about, in John 3:16-17, which is sort of a central Scripture to us as Christians, as that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And then John 3:17 goes into and says, for he came not into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. And so the message of the black church has to be very careful about not condemning the lifestyle of an individual, but being able to talk and deal with the subject of gay marriage in a way that helps to reconcile them to the point where they can find and discover their own relationship with God through love, not through condemnation.
One of the things, Reverend Thorpe, obviously I'm a white guy, and with that, it makes me very much a layman in this arena. And I think that most white people, hating to paint with that big gigantic brush, But most white people, when they think of black theology, have been educated wrongfully, I believe, but by men like Reverend Wright.
Yes.
With all the drama that came out of that, and the theology and the worldview that you're advancing in this show, and by the way, the things I've read about you are about as contrary from that position as you can be. And the reason I'm saying is I think there's a misunderstanding in the community at large about what black theology is.
Right. Yeah, I think black theology is really sort of it's sort of an addition to what was happening in the civil rights movement. Obviously, we understand the history of oppression in the United States as it relates to African Americans, the slave movement. You're dealing with segregation, Jim Crow, the disenfranchisement of African Americans as it relates to equal opportunity and equal access to services and goods, institutionalized racism. And so as you start dealing with that, the black church has always been sort of the voice in the consciousness of America as it relates to oppression in the black community. And so that theology came about because of the significance of Scripture and how Jesus dealt with social change. You have to understand that Scripture and Jesus during the gospel movement, he dealt in essence with social change. He was dealing with the religious elite that used the law in a way to enslave people. And so when Jesus came, he really was trying to highlight the importance of really the essence of God, and that we all have the necessary freedoms. We have freedom of choice. We are free moral agents. We have the ability to choose and to discover what it is that we are supposed to be in relationship with God. And so the black theology was really using the tool of Scripture, which highlights social change according to the gospel movement of Christ, to really make a point in terms of the importance of African Americans, the disenfranchisement, the suffocating power of racism in our country, and how that still impacts us, to really create a sort of a liberation movement for African Americans to feel as if they have a voice in society.
Reverend Thorpe, can I just jump in here, because you clearly have some well thought out concepts, and one of the concerns that I've heard from folks within the religion world, if you will, is that having discussions about, for instance, gay marriage in particular, may very well be there are concerns that there will be blowback. Either in the sense that making comments, standing within the pulpit, or even having conversations among friends saying that you are against, for whatever reason, you are against gay marriage, may be illegal in some cases, may cause a church to lose their tax status, that there may be some blowback against even having conversations. How are you handling this?
Well, it goes back in terms of understanding theocracy versus democracy. And oftentimes there's always been a discussion about the separation of church and state. But what I would say, and to really sort of create a new dialogue here, is that there is a connection between theocracy and democracy. See, you have to see, my frame of reference is really dealing with, my faith perspective. And as I'm looking at sort of the sovereignty of God in this situation, and I see no separation between theocracy and democracy based upon this.
But what if government sees it, even though you don't see it? The strong arm of government is, at least that's the threat, and certainly the fear, may come right in and say, even though you don't see it, they see it, and they will punish you for having those opinions.
And I think that we have to be very careful in terms of the narrative, because if we understand that the founding fathers of America based their Declaration of Independence and constitutional rights based upon our love for God. And so as I'm thinking about this, we have to be very careful in terms of the narrative here, is that we understand that, as according to the Declaration of Independence, that it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That we have to be very careful that we are not infringing upon the rights of people democratically as well as theocratically, and that there has to remain a separation of church and state, and that as a ordained minister, I honor the choice of the LGBT community to marry, but also I honor my reverence to God and what Scripture says as well. And what I mean by that is not by condemning them in terms of in the narrative, but loving them. See, the question we have to ask ourselves is we got to be very careful here, especially in the church, in the black church, is that we condemn and we have there's a great fervor as it relates to sort of the impact of the ruling upon the church and the lack of control that the church may have as it relates to this ruling. But at the end of the day, the mission of the church does not change, because the mission of the church is to restore people, to reconcile people, to bring people to a relationship with God and through Christ with the aspect of love. And so my love does not put barriers on what can be done through people. My love does not condemn individuals, and neither does the Scripture condemn people based upon the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think that needs to be understood, is that the narrative should not be, well, we're going to lose power because of the Supreme Court ruling. It's about honoring democracy while honoring theocracy, and that the two of those can still merge and allow people the freedom to discover who they're supposed to be.
Reverend Thorpe, does that mean that you'll be, I just want to make sure just to be clear before we run out of time, will you be performing gay marriages?
Well, that's a good question there.
Save it for the end.
That's a very good question. I honor their choice to marry, but at this moment, I would have to really evaluate what the essence of what God would have me to do in that situation. And I think for me, I'm still having that dialogue with myself. And that's so I could not answer that at this moment. At this moment, I have not performed any marriages. I have not been part of any marriage ceremonies where there have been gay people who've been interested in asking me to perform that type of a service.
Sure.
And so that, again, for me, is about honoring what's important. And while I honor the choice of gay people and their right to marry, that's still a dialogue that I'm still having with myself as it relates to it. And I have not come to a conclusion on that.
Amen.
So that's a very difficult choice to make at this moment.
Reverend Thorpe, we're out of time, but listen, I want to find out if a listener has an interest in following up with you, is there a way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, they can find me on Facebook, on my website. They can reach me at www.eliakimthorpespeaks.com. You can find all of my social media handles. It's great to have this type of conversation, and I believe that the dialogue that we're having is an important dialogue to have. Obviously, it's still making me think about my stance as it relates to Scripture, and while I have a specific biblical belief about the role of marriage, male and female, I still honor the right of gays to be married. Now the question becomes is where does the church play in that, and how do we honor Scripture while honoring the choice of individuals? I think that continues to be the question.
Now listen, Reverend Thorpe, we're out of time, but as we go forward and this circumstance unwinds here in America, I'd like to be able to call on you again. I appreciate you being on with us, and folks, we'll be back in just a moment.
Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
But first, we have to introduce the Enigma Report with Mike Hewitt.
I wish you folks could see us laughing at each other right now. Listen, enigma is defined as a person or a thing that is mysterious, puzzling, or difficult to understand. And Jim and I touched on some topics that I perceive as being enigmas in the first segment, and I want to kind of cap that segment off with a final Hillary thought, and then we'll dive into what I had planned for this segment here. She said yesterday, people should and do trust me. And given the fact that the polls overwhelmingly state that people don't trust her, it was an enigma that she would, to me, that she would even bother to say that. Rather than trying to earn trust, she states that people do trust.
Well, Goebbels, the propaganda minister for the Nazi Party, for over a decade, has a famous quote. It's been kind of fudged a little bit, but the essential point of his quote is that a falsehood, if repeated often enough, becomes a truth. And as we know with Sarah Palin, who has been, of course, misrepresented by Saturday Night Live and others, as
she could see Alaska from her front porch,
which of course is what Saturday Night Live skit repeated ad nauseum, but was never true. What Sarah Palin did say,
she actually could see Alaska from her front porch.
No, that's not what she said. What she said, there are places in Alaska, when she was referencing how important our foreign policy towards Russia is. She said there are places in Alaska where you can actually see the Russian country. And so that has been repeated often enough to the point where I would imagine that 90% of America who cares about things of that sort believe it to be true. And Hillary Clinton, if in fact you are a lifetime liar, and if in fact you have a media that basically supports your election, you can say anything you want and get away with it. And the key is, in particular, if it is in fact a non-truth, then you must say it often and often and often. And I think it's brilliant on her behalf. As a matter of fact, how many people have to actually get up and say, I think people should trust me and believe me? The people who don't have a life of lying don't need to say that. Most Democrats don't have to get up and say, I think you should believe me. But Hillary Clinton finds that necessary because, in good measure, she has lived a life of very easily provable lies.
In an Associated poll, they report that 61% said the word honest describes her slightly or not at all. And so when you're to your points that you were making, it's kind of like the used car guy, not to pick on used car people, that says, honest, you can trust me. Or the Georgia guarantee, if everything I said is in the honest to God truth, you can come back and call me a liar. So,
I'd like to see that poll, though. Let's just say Jeb Bush, for instance. How many people would believe that he is trustworthy, or partially or not? I think that most people, and matter of fact, I can assure you, there are very, very few politicians. If I was asked by a poll, do you trust this person, I would say no. So I don't think that particular poll tells us much about her.
There's an enigma. I think he's trying to endorse Jeb.
Well, it would tell us that most people do not trust politicians. It doesn't matter what flavor they may be.
So we're talking about the Clintons and the Bushes. And speaking of history, let me segue away. Speaking of history, because I thought where I put them all, whether you like them or not, to me, they ought to be history. We talked about the Confederate flag. Everyone's talked about it at length to the point of being what I consider to be silly. And that group of folks that have advocated that, and by the way, I didn't disagree with them, but now they're wanting to get rid of George Washington, the monument, get rid of Thomas Jefferson, the monument, and in fact they're wanting to rename Washington, D.C. because these people were all slaveholders, etc. And listen, I got to tell you, if we erase the bad things in our history, we can almost guarantee that we'll have those bad things in our future. I think we need to slow down a little bit. What do you think?
Well, I like that phrase. If we erased our history, if people aren't aware of the history, then it's almost a guarantee that we will see it in the future. My thought on this is, it's the law of unintended consequence. And it would seem to me that if you have said, and if you buy into, and virtually every politician has, that the Confederate battle flag is so offensive that it must be banned from every media. We must take off the old what was the TV show that had the Southern car in it?
Dukes of Hazzard.
The Dukes of Hazzard, and things of that sort.
It was a General Lee flag, but let's not split hairs.
If the country has bought into that, then why not get rid of monuments to other slaveholders? Because those are the triggers that bring out the fear and the angst of the past.
Listen, I get it, but for me, I think if we're going to get out a big gigantic eraser, I genuinely think that we're risking our future to do that.
I would agree with you, but again,
listen,
we've bought into it already. We've already said if it makes you feel bad, we must ban it.
No, I gotta
Republicans,
tell you,
Democrats, side by side, standing in support of that concept.
Taking the Confederate flag off the Capitol top, I don't blame them. I really don't. The Capitol existed there for 100 years after the Civil War without the flag. Not having it there doesn't bother me one way or another. To dig up a Confederate general from a park and move him outside the city limits of Memphis, to me those things are just disgusting.
I agree with you,
So,
but where do you stop?
Exactly
That's the problem.
Where do you stop? One of the places we could stop is by pausing before we erase our history and make sure that we actually know our history. And listen, I'm not trying to make this into a big racial conversation, but we can't ignore the fact that when you look back on what slavery was, it included a lot of black people that were slave traders. The first black slave owner was black in the colonies. Several of the largest slaveholders were free black men. And I'm not taking a side. I'm not defending. By the way, my family didn't get here till 1881. I don't feel like I've got a dog in that hunt, as it were. But when I look back at it and say, if we're going to erase history, I think that's dangerous, as I've said, but we got to be truthful before we get the eraser out. And let's make sure we understand what we're erasing.
The eraser's already out. That horse is gone from the barn, pal.
You may be exactly right with that. I think it's extraordinarily unfortunate. If you are, unfortunately, you're probably right. Here's an enigma. Senator Baldwin is a U.S. senator.
Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin. Oh my golly.
Member of the Democratic Party. Her words: certainly the First Amendment says that an institution of faith, that there is an absolute power to observe deeply held religious beliefs. But I don't think it extends far beyond that. And what she's saying is that she doesn't think that the First Amendment and freedom of speech protects you as an individual. Doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or a constitutional party. You as a U.S. citizen, if you're an individual, she doesn't think the First Amendment protects you. And I got to tell you, folks, I find that a fearsome enigma because that's not what Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peace. See
if that protects you. See if that protects you. If you're a white person and you say the N-word on television or on the radio.
Well, but listen, that's a social thing, and what they'll tell you is that the First Amendment doesn't limit society from slapping you in the face, but rather the Bill of Rights is designed to limit government from what they can do.
Have you seen condemnation of this Democrat senator? Remember, we only have 100 senators in the country. Have you seen any condemnation of this senator's comments from anyone? Probably not. Probably not even from the Republican Party. Here's the problem. When you have change, it doesn't come in a tsunami. It comes in little dribs and drabs. You have people set out little comments to see how that flies. See if people will start to buy. We know this on our university campuses that are so massively funded by state and mostly federal money, that if they have concepts such as trigger warnings, they have speech codes. They even have free speech areas roped off by rope. This is not something new. This is something that has been growing and metastasizing for decades. It's only in the last 6 years, though, has it really, really started to ramp up.
Listen, I was torn with ending with a comment about the most significant threat to our freedom, at least that I perceive. And I think it's willful ignorance. If you watch the person on the street interviews, then I was torn between that and talking about the Seattle, Washington deal where they say a child from 12-year-old and up can't buy a Coke or a candy bar, but can have an IUD or a morning after pill without parental knowledge or consent.
At what age?
At sixth grade enough.
Sixth grade.
And I thought I could talk about that because that's an enigma to me. But I thought I would end it real briefly. How much time do I have, Brian? 2 minutes? The Roaring '20s were a populist, socialist, race, authority, and labor rioting period in America. Flappers against social norms, straight and otherwise casual sex, tattoos and piercings gone wild, the rise of atheism and yet another push against Christianity, an explosion of communications capacity, economic transitions across all sectors, massive economic and social gaps, so many similarities to our time. But consider this, though, while Jim and I and everyone else kind of was worried on the edge of our chair about is America falling apart, the generation that I described shares a bunch of commonalities with the young generation right now. But the generation that I just described raised America's greatest generation. And I tell you that because if we keep fighting the good fight, if we keep in there trying to press knowledge and trying to advance communication amongst everybody, I think we're going to be okay. What do you think, Jim, in our final couple seconds?
I think the definition of "we" is in important, and unfortunately, too many parents or parent do not share your view. That to me is the terrible tragedy of America today.
They didn't share it then.
We'll see.
They didn't share it
I sure
then.
hope you're right.
I'm telling you, it looked the same. So flappers. I had an aunt that was a flapper. I remember showing my 14-year-old sister back when we were kids. Want to see my tattoos? I'll never forget the look on my sister's face of pure humiliation and dread. Please, Aunt Fame, don't ever do that again. Folks, we'll see. We'll see you next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, we're going to dive right into this Enigma report thing because as we get this dialed up and tuned in, I'm liking it a lot, and I wish you could see Brian Thomas holding me up. 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 4 seconds. Folks, we'll see you next Wednesday at exactly 9 a.m. Have a great week.
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station.